I'm Jim Gallagher, and I'm talking with author Ryan Rodgers about his new book, Where the Green Light Shines. Where the Green Light Shines is a biography of sorts of legendary Minnesota paddler Bob O'Hara. The book spans generations and includes important people in early Minnesota canoe culture, including Ernest Oberholzer and Sig Olson and others, and goes right up through to today. Ryan, explain the canoe culture of Minnesota for those who might be unfamiliar and how it could give rise to a character like O'Hara.
I'd been a participant in this canoe culture of Minnesota, a bit player, just a boundary waters tripper. Prior to this project, I'd never really thought about what that entailed or its origins. And it wasn't until framing this book around Bob's story that I really began to see the cause and effect that had occurred through generations of paddlers that gave rise to this popular canoe culture of Minnesota today. I think a lot of us we go on canoe trips without ever really thinking about how we're doing things and why we're doing things. Is just taken for granted as a Midwestern or Minnesota thing you do. You put your canoe on the top of your car and you head up to the boundary waters and you pack certain foods and you bring a certain set of gear, and really by doing these things we're participating in these canoe traditions that have been formed over many years through a number of interesting characters who were themselves integral to maintaining the boundary waters as the paddling paradise that it is today.
You mentioned at one point in your book that the Boundary Waters canoe area is an incubator for adventure. Explain that a little bit.
As I was looking for all these interesting paddlers to profile, there was this common thread about how they had come to the Arrowhead to northeastern Minnesota. Like all these prominent adventurers that we know of today, there's Lonnie Dupre and Ann Bancroft and Will Steger and Paul Schurke and Dave and Amy Freeman, and the list goes on. The Boundary Waters is this fairly significant patch of wild land that has been minimally altered by modern society, and a certain type of person is drawn to that. It's a very important landscape for a certain type of person. The masses are satisfied by what it is, by its limitations, whereas others are see it really as more of a launching point where they get a taste of the 2 million acres of the boundary waters. They get a taste for that, and they want more, and so they seek out greater adventures in more distant places.
The core of the book is a biography of Minnesota paddler Bob O'Hara, and the book's subtitle is A 50-Year Odyssey from the Boundary Waters to the Far North. So tell us about O'Hara's Odyssey.
I mean, Bob O'Hara is a singular guy. He really devoted his life to canoe trips, and for many of us, canoe trips are important. They're an important part of our lives, but they're not the central feature. I mean, really, very few, if any, people put as much emphasis on canoe journeys as Bob O'Hara, who's this retired high school teacher from the Twin Cities, and he stumbled on canoeing as a Boy Scout back in the 1950s without ever really thinking about where it was taking him, and the decades went by and he found himself one of the most traveled paddlers on the planet.
Well, tell us about the green light that is in the title and is a theme that runs through the book.
You know Bob, Jim. I mean, Bob's a practical guy. He's got a number of catchphrases. There's keep the round side down. I really like that one.
Yeah.
There's if you want to rough it, put sandpaper in the seat of your pants.
I've heard that many times.
And then there's when the light is green, you go. In Bob's meaning, it's very practical advice. If the weather is good, if the conditions are safe, you don't dilly in camp. You get on the river, you get on the lake, and you make miles while the going is good. Whereas I took a little more of a fanciful take on it and used the green light to refer to the joy of wilderness travel, which ultimately is the thing that draws people to the wilderness, in my opinion, and keeps them coming back.
How did you first meet O'Hara?
I met Bob O'Hara while working on a book about cross-country skiing. Someone said, "Oh, you've got to talk to this guy, Bob O'Hara," and I emailed him. And he wrote me right back very, very quickly. Bob had written a brief history on cross-country skiing. To this email he sent me, he attached a file listing all the rivers he had canoed. And I opened this attachment, and I was kind of shocked. At the time, I really had never thought much about all the rivers in northern Canada. Later on, I was looking for a story to pitch to the Minnesota Conservation Volunteer, the DNR magazine, and I suggested that one, and they were on board, and I went over to Bob's house a couple of times and listened to these stories and was really blown away by all these adventures he's had and the span of time that they occurred over. And I later wrote a longer article. It was really long. It was 8,000 or 9,000 words about his trips. Really, it wasn't until later when he started talking about his early trips that I was further impressed with the commitment and ambition of his journeys. I mean, he dedicated his life to taking these trips, and with some pretty significant sacrifices in terms of, family and home life.
Yeah, those early trips were in a different time. I've been hearing his stories for 30 years, and I've heard many of them from those early trips. Just paper maps. There was no satellite communicators or anything else. You let the RCMP, know that where you were going, and if there was any issues, they might come looking for you after you've been, delayed for a while, but completely different time. We miss that. I was too young for that. I get to experience, and you get to experience what you can. And O'Hara certainly caught the ending of one era and the beginning of another. You mentioned that Bob has traveled with upwards of 100 people over the course of his many canoe journeys. You had a lot of material to choose from. How did you decide which stories and which people to include?
When he began talking about his earlier trips, there was a natural arc with those, the formative period, and him taking these early journeys and sort of coming on his own as a paddler, and then his obsession with the Northwest Passage, which unfolded over a number of years and added a nice narrative arc to it. The later ones, they are more numerous and they cover more time, yet those get less space. The more he canoed, the more refined his techniques became, and as he got older, he also got less ambitious and more cautious, which, is great on a trip, but it makes for a less interesting story.
This is what we're reading on KAXE. We're hearing a conversation between longtime Northern Community Radio volunteer and paddler Jim Gallagher and Minnesota writer and journalist Ryan Rodgers. Ryan's new book gives us a glimpse into the world of Arctic canoeing, told through the journeys of a true master of the craft, Bob O'Hara. It's called Where the Green Light Shines. Once again, Jim Gallagher.
As we talked, Ryan reminded me of a conversation he and I had about how I first connected with O'Hara. My first trip in the barren lands of northern Canada was on the Thelon River in 1992. O'Hara happened to be on the river ahead of us that summer.
I remember talking to you years ago, Jim, and you had a good story about how you met Bob in the first place.
On the Thelon River, my wife and I go through the last rapids, the last run out on the Thelon Canyon, and my wife sees this red thing bobbing in the foam below the rapids, and I maneuver over and she plucks it out of the water, and it's a fishing pole case, and I'm thinking, all right, somebody's loss is my gain. I got a new fishing pole, and friends that I was traveling with, we're looking at it and said, oh, there's a name on it. Oh darn. And it's Bob O'Hara, St. Louis Park or Minneapolis, whatever his address was at that time. But he was traveling with a group, Judith Nemi and some other women, and him and one paddling partner. People ahead of him were having difficulties and heard some screaming, so him and his partner, hightailed it down the rapids and apparently had some trouble because they lost some equipment. And Bob's a little tight-lipped about, what exactly happened at the end there. And we tease him about that a cold swim happened at some point, and he lost the fishing pole case. And when we got back, I gave him a call and said, well, I got your fishing pole case, and arranged to get it back. And that was just the beginning of a friendship, the beginning of a relationship. Traveled with him 4 times and visited and stayed with him at his house many times. And all through this kind of serendipitous plucking a fishing rod case out of the rapids, 30 years later, here we are talking about him.
There was one where Bob was being a little cranky, as I recall it. I believe it was your wife started tickling him. Am I remembering that one correctly?
Some people deal with Bob differently. And me, I just kind of quiet, shake my head, and I try not to engage because we're both Irish, and it can maybe quick to anger, and then it gets ugly. And so I do things differently. When Bob would start crabbing, Kay would just reach over and just start tickling him and jumping on him. And she gets away with that. We're talking about Bob's personality here. He has a personality and a trip leadership style that comes up frequently in your writing, both from the journals of his trip mates and your direct observations. You want to talk about that just a little bit?
Part of what made this interesting was as a character study of Bob.
As you said, he has a style. I would call it an old school style of trip where one person is in charge and calls the shots.
I mean, part of that has got to be generational. Bob is in his mid-80s now, and on some of his early trips with some really prominent paddlers, that pattern was established. I don't want to judge what style is better. Perhaps if you have one person in charge who's the most experienced, that's a great way to stay safe. His safety record does speak for itself in that he never had a major incident on a trip during more than half a century and dozens of trips to these remote rivers in a time when there was no way to communicate with the outside world. He is an interesting character. There's this equation that equals Bob, and I mean his severity at times is definitely part of that equation.
Well, later in the book, you have a chapter called Confluence. And could you read a paragraph from that for me?
O'Hara was as dedicated as ever to his trips. The Aerosmith became his favorite to date. Then 3 years later, in 2008, he ran the Hood River, and it was as fine as any he'd ever done. But he was starting to taste salt in the river that was his own. How the tide from the unmappable sea beyond was reaching up current from his own river's mouth, coming from the place he inexorably paddled toward.
Tell us about that paragraph. I especially wondered about the taste of salt, that idea of approaching the end of one's river of life.
So I was extrapolating a little bit on Bob's experience through these years because it's not something he would really discuss directly. I mean, Bob still has a list of far north trips he wants to do. I mean, he goes. He doesn't think about stopping. He pushes forward. He has his Boundary Waters permits for this summer. I think he has 2 of them, which will be, every year since 1959, canoeing and camping in the Boundary Waters, pushing 70 consecutive years. He's not oblivious. He knows he's mortal. I guess it's considering what's going through his mind on some level as he nears the end of the activity that really directed the course of his entire life.
He's got a plan, and it involves the future. Thanks so much for talking with us today, Ryan. To take us out, would you mind reading another passage, please?
Of course. O'Hara wanted more, too. More days in his canoe with the sun on his face. More nights in his tent under the inky sky. He sat back on his chair and listened to the birds. His green light no longer ripped like wildfire across the tundra, blinding him to everything else like the unswerving fanaticism of the flicker chicks. But it still burned, having illuminated a path different from anything he had imagined. His route here still struck him as pure serendipity, like he'd paddled into an unexpected channel and followed it toward an unknown sea, always seeking what lay beyond the next bend, Until he had traveled so far, the only choice was to keep going, to ride the river to its mouth. And then what? That's what he would find out. On the river flowed.
That was Ryan Rodgers reading from his book, Where the Green Light Shines, a 50-year odyssey from the Boundary Waters to the far north. The book is due out July 28th on University of Minnesota Press.